Scientists are warning that more than half of the world's wild coffee species are at risk of extinction.
But scientists right here in the UK are ringing the alarm about climate change and how it could put your morning cup of coffee at risk.
Climate change is going to negatively impact the quality of coffee in the future. Scientists say.
At the start of this year, a paper was published titled High Extinction Risk for Wild Coffee Species and Implications for Coffee Sector Sustainability. It was picked up by a number of news outlets, and they all covered it a little bit, but I wanted to know more. So I travelled down to the Royal Botanic Gardens at Kew to speak to the lead author, Dr. Aaron Davis. I'd met Aaron previously at a symposium event where he'd given a fantastic talk, and we'd stayed in touch since. You might recognise him as the author of the Coffee Atlas of Ethiopia. The gardens at Kew are open to the public and are fascinating and beautiful, but I was excited that I could meet Aaron in the herbarium. It's Kew's collection of plant species, over 7 million samples collected from around the world. And we sat in an alcove and discussed the paper and its implications, and coffee and genetics, and so much more for an hour or so. Here's that conversation, which I hope you enjoy.
My name is Aaron Davis. I am Senior Research Leader here at the Royal Botanic Gardens Kew. I head up the Plant Resources team, but I am a coffee specialist. I suppose I'm a coffee biologist, but by training I am a botanist.
At what point in your career did you begin to specialise in coffee?
About 20 years ago, I did a postdoctoral study in Madagascar. And part of that project was to investigate the wild coffees of Madagascar. It was an opportunity, it was purely by chance that I ended up working on coffee. But within a short period, I became fascinated by the organism. In those early days, I didn't really connect it with the beverage or the industry or the sector.
Right.
That came quite a bit later.
For me, I think I met you 6 years ago, I think, and it was incredibly exciting for me to meet someone who seemed outside of my industry. We seem to have our fixed experts, and then you appeared and knew so much about coffee in this whole other sense than anyone else I'd really spoken to. More than just this one species that is my day-to-day life and most people's relationship with coffee, Arabica, right? Like you opened my mind to the idea of the sheer volume of species that are out there, which is what I want to talk about just quickly.
Yeah.
So most people watching this will probably know Arabica. They probably know Robusta as its trade name, so to speak. They've maybe heard of something like Liberica, and that's 3 of 124 species. And I had no idea that there were this many.
Going back to where I started, what fascinated me was here was a crop plant of global significance, globally important commodity, and we didn't know how many species there were, or very much really about some of the wild species, and that's what I did for at least 10 years. In fact, still doing today. So the process is of what we call describing new species. It has been going on for many centuries, and essentially you're looking for plants that differ from other plants. What are the differences? You're cataloguing the diversity of the coffee genus. So some of them were discovered in the sense that we were walking in the forest and we found them for the very first time. Others were found here in the herbarium that had been collected maybe 100 years ago, but had languished sort of undiscovered to scientists, so we say.
In terms of the other species out there, I think, if you've read your coffee history, you might have come across Eugenoides, one of the 2 parents of Arabica, and you might have come across, I think Euchers wrote about Stenophila.
Yes.
In a very positive way.
Yes.
It was better, he said.
But he got the idea from somebody else.
Oh, really? Where did he get that idea from?
It's been copied back through history. So I think it was a French scientist or a French coffee specialist who first said that it was better than Arabica, or as good as Arabica.
I think these sort of species are really the beginning of the wider story that your paper is telling, right? Like the paper you published at the start of this year, Can I be difficult? I'd have a go of myself, but can you give a very brief summary of the paper? I'll make sure it's linked below here so people can read it.
Can I start again back all those years ago when I first started with coffee? Because one of the things that became very apparent very quickly was a lot of these species were incredibly rare and threatened in the wild. And at that point, I thought we needed to start to gather the data to make a genus-wide, a coffee-wide assessment. So last year we had the opportunity to actually do that properly through the IUCN Red List system. So that's a very stringent system where you assess the threat status, the extinction status of any plant or animal. So we did that for coffee, and what we found was that actually 60% of those 124 coffee species are threatened with extinction, including Arabica. But it gets a little bit worse than that, because if you look at the material that's in seed collections, living collections, what we call germplasm collections, it's not really properly conserved. There's not enough species representation, there's not enough representation of wild populations, including our key beverage species.
Why do we want to preserve them? What's the, I mean, beyond just it's nice to have lots of species because it's nice to have lots of species, what's the bigger plan for those potential species in the future?
So that's one of the things we're really saying in the paper, is that we need these species for the long-term sustainability of the sector. Now that might seem a bit fanciful, a bit science fiction, but in fact if you look back at the history of coffee cultivation, that's exactly what we've done. We've taken new species, such as Robusta, and we've taken different plants from different populations with particular attributes that have helped the industry sustain production, whether that's disease, pest resistance, climate tolerance, etc., etc. We've called on those resources time and time again to sustain coffee production.
Does climate change explain why we're interested in other species again when we hadn't been, it seems, for quite a long time? Your paper references, I think, some work from the 20s, late 50s, early 60s that shows interest in other species, and then there's this seeming gap where we're not particularly interested in other species.
I think the reason is Robusta, or the main reason is that here we are with this new plant came along, really got going in early 20th century, 1920s, 1930s, and there wasn't really much need to look at those other species.
It had everything we needed.
It had productivity, it had other useful attributes. It was easy to grow, it was robust, hence the name Robusta. I mean, what was the point in developing other species when we had this duopoly of two species that actually fulfilled our requirements?
Now, you, in the paper, you categorised these species in two different ways. Firstly, by how endangered they are, from critically through to, I can't remember the language you use at the other end of like not particularly endangered. So
least concern.
Least concern, that's the correct phrase. What percentage of species were critically endangered, and what time frame are we talking about here? Is this, they could go in the next 5, 10 years? Is this in the next 30 years? How big is the window of action?
But in terms of coffee sector sustainability, there was a high number of critically endangered species in the group that would be the priority for looking at the development.
Which was the other way you divided them, right? In the, is it crop wild
relatives?
It's a funny phrase, crop wild relatives, CWRs. So you divided those into three groups, which was a kind of prioritization based on proximity to Arabica. Is that fair?
Yes, and Robusta.
And Robusta, proximity to commercial agricultural coffee, if you will.
Yeah.
And how big was the sort of priority group?
The priority group is actually quite large. I mean, I'd say at least 35, 40 species.
And where are those species? Are they predominantly Ethiopia or Madagascar too?
No, so the Madagascar ones are in group 3, which is the lower priority group, purely because the chemistry is so different to African representatives in the crop plants.
So I just want to go into, let's say we preserve the species. We preserve this material. What is the practical way that we begin to access that? I've seen, traditional plant crossing happen a lot in coffee. I haven't seen much else? Am I wrong? Have I missed out? Or
Up until now, I think the focus has been on breeding. There are now a range of gene editing techniques.
right, you mentioned somatic fusion in the paper, which I think has been successful for potatoes.
There's a suite of technologies, and those technologies are developing very, very rapidly.
Yeah.
And if you talk to people who plant breed in other plant groups, they're saying to people like me, why aren't you using those techniques?
Sure.
And I think the problem comes down to the public perception of GMO.
Do you think things like, I feel like CRISPR, for example, has had a ton of positive press out there in the world. And CRISPR does have applications for crop plants. It's been used, I think, in rice, though a lot of the work, as far as I can tell, has been more hypothetical than it's been practical. But does something like CRISPR have applications in coffee in the same way?
Absolutely. But the difficulty is, in the US, CRISPR doesn't come under GMO, whereas in Europe, CRISPR comes under genetic modification. Although, if you're a scientist, you would argue that's not actually the case. But I think something like CRISPR could have real potential, particularly with disease resistance.
Right.
And I think if we're really interested in sustainability, and we're trying to tackle some of the major diseases like coffee leaf rust, I think we have to look at those technologies.
So do you think there's an option where very simply we go back and look at the agricultural viability of some of these sort of priority one, pretty close to Arabica robusta kind of species, where we think, what if we start planting these? What if we start growing these? Do they taste good? Is that a...
So that's the work we've started.
Okay.
So we're interested in group 1, which is the main crop species and their parents, Eugenioides, Liberica, Arabica, and Robusta. And then there's priority group 2, which are species that have potential to breed with those species or to breed amongst themselves to make new crops, are species in their own, crop species in their own right, or indeed have been used before. So Liberica is a really good example. I think Liberica has a lot of promise. It does need work, it needs development. But it's been interesting because I'm almost gone full circle. I'm now back looking at wild species, and I think the thing that really excites me is that this isn't fanciful, this isn't science fiction. I really do think there's potential there. We just need the investment, and I'm particularly excited because what I see is the potential to really do something in terms of climatic tolerance.
So I want to dig into climatic tolerance a little bit more. Broadly speaking, Arabica likes altitude, not because of altitude, but because of lots of sunlight, and then a large swing in diurnal temperatures, right? It's warm in the day, cold at night. And that means that you have, you essentially slow the biology of the plant quite a lot at night. You end up with a denser seed and a better tasting product. It's about that fast and slow period, feed,
Yes.
and then slow again.
What we call the cool tropics.
Right. When we talk about climate tolerance, the ability to withstand hotter nights and hotter days is to some extent what we're talking about, as well as, I suspect, less access to water.
I think there's been a lot of focus on temperatures, but in many parts of the world, it's water. It's the availability of water. It's when it's in terms of when it's in the ground, how much is in the ground. So it's really that balance between water and temperature that's important.
But temperature is going to happen,
yes,
right? Like if we continue, we're going to see that half full degree Celsius rise.
And if you look at the climate change models, they're pretty much all in agreement that we're going to see an increase in temperature, or we're seeing an increase in temperature.
Where is this little bit of heat really going to punish Arabica as it is right now?
You can't pinpoint the effect of temperature to any period or any process because of this relationship with water and with seasonality. So, for example, you can withstand 28 degrees if the if the soil is full of water, if it's at full capacity, we say, so it's nicely evenly saturated. But if there's no water in the soil or little water in the soil, 25 degrees could be lethal, 28 degrees could be lethal.
As we go looking for solutions in other species, what characteristics are we really looking for then? Is it that they are able to thrive with less water? Is it to some extent drought resistance, or just a lower daily requirement, so to speak?
Well, you have 124 coffee species, and they have evolved into different habitats. They're adapted. So what we're looking for is plants that have specific climatic tolerance attributes. So that might be a shorter wet season, a longer dry season. So there are plants that are adapted to those sorts of conditions. Or it might be we have a plant that's adapted to very wet conditions, very humid conditions, and that plant might have disease tolerance to fungal pathogens, for example. It's a matter of taking those genetic resources and the attributes to be very prescriptive about the plants that we want. So it might be we're breeding something for East Africa that's completely different to the requirements of Central America.
My concern, as I listen to you talk, is that this feels like a strategy for plant survival, but this is an agricultural plant where yield becomes a huge consideration. And if you have a plant with limited access to water, to some extent, can you cheat your environment to the extent that you can have a high yielding plant that does well with limited rainfall or reduced rainfall?
It's not just about climatic tolerance. It's also about all the other attributes that are required for a crop plant: productivity, taste, market value, ease of cultivation, a willingness of farmers to actually grow the crop in the first place.
Right.
So it's not easy by any means, but as I say, I think I've become increasingly more optimistic about the use of wild species because I'm seeing the potential to meet the requirements for some part of the coffee growing community.
I want to sort of push into towards the conclusions of the paper, and we accept that coffee is threatened. We accept we need to keep as many of these species alive and healthy as possible. And you point out there's a couple of different ways of doing that, and broadly they're divided into in situ and ex situ, right? Like, so in the field, as they would grow in their natural habitats, would be in situ, but you would protect them through national parks or other protected forests. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Ex situ would be cryopreservation.
Yes.
As one option.
Yeah.
It would be something like variety gardens, or would that?
Yeah. So living collections.
Living collections.
It could be in vitro, slow growth in vitro.
Which
so
is, explain that a little bit more. So you're basically growing the plant but slowing its growth incredibly.
Yes, yeah. So you can preserve lots of different species or varieties in a very small space.
And you point out living collections can be problematic, right? Because you can't prevent some level of crossing happening naturally.
That's a problem you would envisage because it's an open pollination environment.
Right.
And indeed, when you look at the genetic data for some of those collections, you can see they've been compromised. Species have intercrossed. And what happens is a lot of those collections are reproduced by seed. So the seed is gathered from the trees, planted, but they've got no way of ensuring that that wasn't produced by a hybrid, or produced by a crossing event. And we see that. We see lines of coffee planted that are meant to be species X, whereas in fact a combination of other species.
So if money were no object and you had limitless resources, what's the best way to preserve all of these species? Is it cryopreservation? Is that the gold standard? Is it living collections, but just really well maintained ones? Is it actually in situ?
I think what you have to remember is that if you're preserving something ex situ, the amount of genetic diversity you can capture ex situ is incredibly limited. I mean, we calculated that there were 13.5 billion genotypes in Ethiopia. Now, you're not going to capture that diversity in an ex situ collection. And that's an extreme example, but it's always going to be a compromise.
Right.
And that's why we do genomics, to find out the variability, so we're capturing as much variability as possible. Ultimately, what you need to do is to preserve things in situ, in the wild, because they're also under continuing selective pressure. They're adapting to the environment, so you want that, and you want that standing variation. But that's no good if you're a coffee breeder. or a producer, you want material that you can access to use. So we do need those living collections. We need those ex situ collections, cryopreservation example that breeders etc. can access easily and quickly to develop the plants that they're working on.
Now, historically, obviously, Ethiopia's a key part of the world when it comes to all of this. As I'd understood it, the Ethiopian government was not super interested in sharing broadly a lot of that genetic wealth, I guess. Is that fair? Is that still the case?
Yeah, I think that's still the case.
Why is that? Why the sort of reluctance to...
I think because if you look back at recent history, I'm not talking hundreds of years ago, I'm talking the last 40, 50 years, material has been taken out of Ethiopia and been developed and been commercially successful, but the Ethiopians would argue, what have we benefited from that? And the answer is absolutely nothing. And geisha is a good example. Many producers are making their livelihoods out of geisha or developing geisha, but none of that IP is flowing back into Ethiopia. So it's quite a recent example and a good one, because geisha is spreading throughout the world as far as I can see.
Does climate change not make keeping in situ collections harder and harder still?
In some places that might be the case. If you have access to irrigation, then you can overcome most of those issues.
And I guess the last impossible question, or the difficult question, is that I read the paper and I understand the problem and I understand the urgency and I understand some of the solutions. And if you're watching this, you maybe feel the same way. Like, okay, I get it. This freaks me out. What can I do? Where's the practical part of this where I, as an individual, be it someone who just drinks coffee or someone in the coffee industry, how do I help?
It's a tricky one because there's so many other things to do. That's the problem, I think. This is one of several problems. We're producers are facing the profitability crisis. Unless we do something about that pretty quickly, lots of producers are going to start giving up producing coffee. And there's what are we doing about Yemen? The crisis in Yemen. It's all interconnected. It's just so many different urgent requirements that it's difficult to actually say, right, I'm going to support A, B, or C. I think it needs serious funding, of course. We're talking, multi-million pound projects. Should it be something at a global scale, something so UN or the World Bank or something large that has the funding to make a real difference? And maybe it's also about better organisation. I actually feel that the coffee research community is quite disparate and quite fragmented for a number of reasons. I think that needs to be resolved.
I'm going to push you one more time.
Yeah,
though.
no, do. Yeah.
No. But I mean, I'm watching this. I'm concerned. What is my action? What is my practical help? Is it donate money to Q? Is it donate money to World Coffee Research? Is it, put pressure wherever I can on organisations to fund something like this? Is it, going out and harassing the Gates Foundation into dropping a check? Is it, the great problem with so much of climate change is that most sensible people accept it. The question of what do I do is not well answered. Take less flights. Okay, do I buy less plastic? Does that make a difference? But if I fly one more time a year, did I just break all my good work? What do you want from me? People, I think, want to participate and they want to move in the right direction. And I think we're all looking for hows. How does this happen? And in this case, that's the question I come back to, which is, I want to see this happen. I want to see the recommendations you make come to fruition. Am I powerless? That may be the case.
No, these are big societal issues, of course, but they're all certainly interconnected. We need a carbon tax. Absolutely, certainly we need a carbon tax across a broad spectrum of human utilities. We've got to stop taking fossil fuels out of the ground. That's absolutely certain. We have to consume less, we have to reduce food waste, all those big things we have to seriously address with powerful legislation and human will. But I still think, looking at coffee production, we need to take a hard look at what we're doing. And I think, we've failed, I think, with certification. Largely, by and large, we've failed. Yes, it has achieved some good. Some farmers clearly benefit, others don't. But we still don't know precisely. We don't even know. We haven't even got a clue, I would say, of the environmental impact of our coffee purchasing. And that is absolutely clear. What's the carbon footprint? Has the coffee I've just purchased resulted in deforestation? The answer is probably yes, in many circumstances. So I think we really need to take a good, hard look at certification in terms of the impact on the environment, because that relates back to losing species. I mean, The reason we're losing species is deforestation and climate change. We have to think holistically, but we do need to think about the way, the coffee that we're purchasing, and be really honest about that. And also, I would say, not just think of it in terms of how the degree of damage, but the degree of good. If you're buying, for example, Ethiopian coffee, you're buying coffee that's associated with forest. Yes, that forest isn't as diverse as it would be without coffee, but if it wasn't for coffee production, there wouldn't be a forest there.
Right.
So we have to sort of start looking at those complexities to perhaps start understand some of our purchasing, and to say, really look at certification, see and to understand exactly what it means.